The dust had not even settled when Zane Farrell rode to the edge of Caldwell, Texas, pulled his horse to a hard stop at the exact point where the town's dirt road met the open range, and looked every approaching rider dead in the eye. It was 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday in October of 1882, and the sun beat down like a judgment from heaven. There were 6 men on horseback coming toward town, and every single one of them worked for Gerald Holt. Zane did not move. He sat straight in the saddle, his jaw set like iron, his dark eyes carrying something that went beyond anger into a territory that most men in Caldwell County had never dared enter. His horse, a big red roan named Copper, stamped one hoof against the hard-packed earth and snorted, as if even the animal understood the gravity of what was happening. The lead rider pulled up 20 feet away. It was Silas Vance, Gerald Holt's foreman, a wide-shouldered man with a reputation for cruelty that stretched from the Rio Grande to the Oklahoma border. He looked at Zane with a slow, measured contempt that he had clearly spent years perfecting. "Farrell," Silas said, his voice low and carrying a barely concealed threat. "Step aside, we have business in town." "Not today," Zane said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. It always carried. Silas shifted in his saddle. "That widow woman is not your concern." And that was when Zane Farrell said it. He said it in a voice that was calm and absolute, in a voice that left no room for negotiation, in a voice that would be repeated in every saloon and general store and barber shop in Caldwell County for years to come. "She is not alone anymore." The words hung in the dry Texas air like smoke after a gunshot. Silas Vance stared at him. The 5 men behind Silas exchanged uneasy looks. Something about the certainty in Zane's voice, something about the way he sat there on that horse with his hands loose and his eyes steady, made every one of those riders reconsider the mathematics of what they were about to do. Zane did not reach for his rifle. He did not posture or threaten. He simply sat there at the town line like a wall that God himself had put in the earth, and he waited. He had been waiting in one way or another for months. And the story of how he arrived at this moment, at this particular stretch of road, on this particular afternoon, with everything on the line, was one that began not with violence or confrontation, but with a woman standing alone in a field of dead corn, staring at something that had been taken from her. It had begun 6 months earlier, in the late spring of 1882, when Delia Warren arrived in Caldwell with nothing but a wagon, a mule, 2 trunks of household goods, and a deed to 40 acres of land that her late husband had bought without her knowledge before he died. Thomas Warren had died of a fever in San Antonio in February of that year, leaving Delia at 26 years old with no children, no family within 500 miles, and a piece of paper that said she owned land in a county she had never visited. She had spent 6 weeks settling his affairs, selling their rented house, paying his remaining debts, and then she had loaded everything she owned onto a second-hand wagon, said goodbye to the few acquaintances she had made in San Antonio, and pointed herself north. She was not a woman who had been raised for hardship exactly, but she was not soft either. Her father had been a schoolteacher in Missouri, and her mother had run their household with the kind of efficient grace that makes everything look easier than it is. Delia had inherited her father's intelligence and her mother's spine, and when life handed her something difficult, her first instinct was to look at it steadily and figure out what needed to be done. What needed to be done, she had decided, was to go to her land and see what she had. What she had, it turned out, was 40 acres of decent soil, a 2-room cabin that needed work on the roof, a well that still produced clean water, and a neighbor problem that was going to require considerably more than a hammer and some cedar shingles. The neighbor problem had a name, and that name was Gerald Holt. Gerald Holt owned the largest cattle operation in Caldwell County, running somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 head across land that stretched in every direction from the center of the county, like a great, hungry hand. He was 60 years old, thick through the middle, and possessed of the absolute conviction that what he wanted, he would eventually obtain, because in Gerald Holt's experience that had always been true. He wanted Delia Warren's 40 acres. It was not because 40 acres would make a material difference to a man who already controlled thousands of acres of range. It was because those 40 acres sat precisely at the northern edge of the creek bed that fed his largest pasture, and because the man who had owned those acres before Thomas Warren had been the only person in the county willing to fight Gerald Holt on water rights, and that man had eventually been forced to sell. Thomas Warren had bought the land from him at a price that suggested he had not fully understood what he was buying into, or perhaps had not lived long enough to find out. Either way, Delia Warren arrived in Caldwell County in late April of 1882 to find that Gerald Holt had already sent a man to the land office in an attempt to file a claim of abandonment on her deed, a claim that had been rejected on the grounds that the land had been purchased outright and the deed was registered. She found this out from the county clerk, a small, precise man named Aldous Finch, who told her with an apologetic expression that Mr. Holt had also attempted to purchase her deed from the executor of her husband's estate before she could claim it herself, and that Mr. Holt had been, in Aldous Finch's careful phrasing, very persistent on the matter. How persistent? Delia had asked. Aldous Finch had looked at her over the top of his spectacles. Persistent enough that I would encourage you to be very careful, Mrs. Warren. She had thanked him and walked out into the dry Texas sunshine and stood on the wooden sidewalk of Main Street, Caldwell, looking out at the wide, flat country around the town, and she had felt something cold settle into her chest. Not fear exactly, something more complicated than fear. Something that was fear, mixed with determination, mixed with the particular anguish of a woman who knows she is completely on her own and has already accepted it. She had driven her wagon out to the 40 acres that afternoon. She had looked at the cabin and the creek and the corn that the previous owner had apparently planted and abandoned, which was already beginning to wilt in the Texas heat. She had looked at all of it, and she had made herself a list of what needed doing, and she had started doing it. She was 3 weeks into the process of making the cabin livable when she met Zane Farrell. She had driven into town to purchase lumber and nails and a new window latch, and she had been loading her purchases into the back of her wagon when a man came out of the hardware store carrying a length of iron pipe over one shoulder and nearly walked directly into her. He stopped. She stopped. They looked at each other. He was 30 years old, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been shaped by years of outdoor work into something honest and angular. He was not classically handsome, but there was a quality to his features, a directness in his dark eyes that made him difficult to look away from. He was wearing a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he had the permanently tanned forearms of a man who spent his life outside. "Pardon me," he said immediately, stepping back and adjusting the pipe on his shoulder so it did not swing toward her. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "Neither was I," Delia said honestly. There was a pause. He looked at the lumber in her arms, then at her wagon, then back at her. "You need help with that?" he asked. It was not a question offered out of condescension. It was the straightforward offer of a man who saw a practical problem and asked if help was wanted. "I have it, thank you," Delia said, and she loaded the last piece of lumber without difficulty. He nodded, as if this answer were entirely satisfactory, and moved to tie the iron pipe to his own wagon, which was parked 2 spaces down. They might have left it at that, except that as Delia climbed up onto her wagon seat and gathered the reins, she heard him pause behind her. "You're the woman who bought the Hendricks land," he said. It was not a question. She turned to look at him. "Thomas Warren bought it. I'm his widow." He studied her for a moment with those direct, unreadable eyes. "I'm Zane Farrell. I own the ranch that borders your north fence line." Delia absorbed this information. "Then we're neighbors." "We are," he said. "And since we are, I should tell you something, neighbor to neighbor." He glanced down the street in a way that was almost casual, but she noticed that he checked the direction of the Holt Ranch office before he looked back at her. "Gerald Holt is going to cause you trouble. He's been after that land for 3 years. He won't stop because you showed up with a legal deed." "So I've been told," Delia said. "I want you to know that if you need anything, my ranch is less than 2 miles north. My name is Farrell, and I mean what I say." She looked at him for a long moment. In her experience, men who volunteered their help in the first conversation were usually volunteering something other than what they claimed. Thomas had been like that, all warm promises and a helpful face, and she had spent 4 years discovering the darker complications underneath. But there was something different about the way this man said it. He was not leaning toward her. He was not performing warmth. He said it with the same practical directness with which he had asked if she needed help with the lumber, as if offering help was simply something you did for a neighbor, and the offer was made plainly and without performance. "Thank you, Mr. Farrell," she said. She drove home. She thought about him more than she expected to on the drive back. The trouble from Gerald Holt began within the week. It started with his cattle. Several dozen head turned up inside her fence line on a Monday morning, having come through a section of fence that she had checked and found intact the previous Friday. She rode over to inspect the break and found that the fence posts had been pulled clean out of the ground, not broken, not knocked over, but pulled out by something or someone with considerable strength and deliberate intention. She spent the better part of Monday repairing the fence. On Wednesday, it happened again. On Friday, she drove to Holt's Ranch headquarters, a large, well-maintained operation about 4 miles south and west, and she asked to speak with Gerald Holt. She was kept waiting for 40 minutes in the sun before a man came out and told her that Mr. Holt was unavailable, but that Mr. Holt's attorney in Caldwell would be happy to discuss the matter of the cattle trespass. She went to see Holt's attorney, a man named Prescott Drake, who was smooth and careful and explained to her very politely that the land she was occupying was the subject of some dispute regarding the validity of the original survey, and that Mr. Holt might be willing to purchase the property from her at a fair price in order to avoid the expense and inconvenience of a legal contest. Delia asked what price he considered fair. He named a figure that was roughly half of what the property had sold for the previous year. She stood up, thanked him politely, and walked out of his office. That was a Thursday. On Saturday morning, she found her well had been fouled. Someone had thrown something into it. Animal remains by the smell of it, and the water had gone bad overnight. It would take days to clean the well and render it usable again, days during which she would need to haul water from the creek, which was a considerably greater labor, especially in the Texas heat that was now climbing toward summer. She was at the creek with 2 wooden buckets, hauling her 3rd load of the morning, when she heard a horse and turned to find Zane Farrell riding along the fence line from the north, apparently checking the fence on his own property. He stopped his horse when he saw her with the buckets. He took one look at the situation, and whatever he saw on her face, he swung down from his horse without a word and picked up one of the buckets. "Tell me what happened," he said. She told him. She told him about the fence and the attorney and the well, and she told it without self-pity or dramatization because she was not a woman given to either. She told it the way she would have read from a list. He listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I'll send a man over to help with the well," he said. "I have a hand named Clem who has cleaned more fouled wells than most people have had hot meals. He'll have it done by tomorrow." "I can't afford to hire. I'm not asking for payment," he said. "You're my neighbor. This is what neighbors do." There it was again, that simple, unornamented directness. She studied him. "And what do you get out of it, Mr. Farrell?" He looked at her steadily. "A good neighbor," he said. "That's all. Good neighbors on the frontier matter more than most people realize until they don't have any." She thought about that. "All right," she said. "I'll accept the help with the well." He sent Clem over the next morning, a cheerful, weathered man of about 50 who could have cleaned the well in his sleep, and who, while he worked, told her stories about Zane Farrell that she suspected the man himself would not have told her in 100 years. Clem talked while he worked, the natural monologue of a man who spent most of his time alone with cattle. He told her that Zane Farrell had come to Caldwell County 7 years ago with almost nothing, had bought the smallest piece of poor land he could afford, and had built his operation year by year through sheer, unbroken effort, until he had 250 acres and a solid herd. He told her that Zane had bought the freedom of 3 men Gerald Holt had imprisoned on false debt charges, not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. He told her that Zane had lost his younger brother to a riding accident 2 years ago, and had quietly taken responsibility for supporting his brother's wife, a woman named Clara who had since remarried and moved to Austin, but who still wrote to Zane with gratitude in every letter. Delia listened to all of this while she mended the roof above the cabin's front room. In the evenings, after the work of the day was done, she would sit on the small porch of the cabin and look at the darkening Texas sky, and she would think about the situation she was in, and she would occasionally find herself thinking about Zane Farrell and the exact quality of steadiness that came off him like a quiet heat. She was careful with those thoughts. She had been married for 4 years to a man who had seemed steady and turned out to be a man of hidden debts and hidden disappointments, a man who had never been dishonest exactly, but who had never been fully present either. She had loved Thomas in the early years, or something she had called love, and she had grieved him when he died, not with the shattering grief of a great love lost, but with the complicated grief of someone mourning a relationship that had never quite become what it was supposed to be. She was in no hurry to give her heart to anyone. She was in the middle of a fight for her land and her livelihood, and that fight needed her complete attention. Zane came by her fence line again the following Tuesday. He was doing genuine work on his own fence. She could see that, but the section of his fence that happened to need work was the section directly adjacent to her property. And when he came to the boundary, he paused and looked over with those dark eyes of his. "How's the well?" he called. "Good as new," she called back. "Please thank Clem again." He nodded. Then, after a moment, he said, "Holt sent a man to the county commissioner on Monday. He's trying to contest the survey boundaries on the southern edge of your property." Delia came to the fence. "On what grounds?" "He claims the original survey was done by an unlicensed surveyor in 1879. Zane's voice was careful and neutral. "It won't hold up if you can produce the original survey documents. Do you have them?" She had them. She had all of Thomas's papers, carefully preserved in a cedar box. She told Zane this. "Good," he said. "Take them to Aldous Finch at the county clerk's office and ask him to register them officially. Once they are on the county record, the challenge becomes much harder." She looked at him. "How do you know all this?" A brief pause. Because Holt tried the same thing with me 3 years ago. I learned how the game is played. She drove to town that afternoon with the survey documents, and Aldous Finch registered them with an expression of quiet satisfaction, the expression of a man who had seen this particular fight before and was glad to see it go the right way. On the way home, she stopped at the post office and found a letter from her mother in Missouri, the first letter her mother had written since Thomas's death, and she sat in the wagon and read it twice. Her mother wrote in practical terms, asking if Delia needed to come home, offering the spare room, noting that a schoolteacher in Jefferson City was looking for a wife and was a respectable man. Delia folded the letter very carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She did not write back for 3 days, and when she did, she wrote, "I am staying. I have land. I am not alone." She meant it as a statement of defiance, not a fact, but she wrote it, and writing it made it feel more true than it had before. The real trouble arrived with summer. In June, 3 of Delia's fence lines were cut in the same night, and in the morning, 40 head of Holt's cattle were spread across her cornfield, which had by that point been replanted and was beginning to show the promise of a real crop. The cattle destroyed most of a week's growth in a matter of hours. She stood in the ruined corn and felt something collapse briefly in her chest before she assembled it back together. She looked at the damage carefully and systematically, estimating what could be salvaged and what was lost. Zane appeared at the north fence line within the hour. He had heard about it in town, apparently, because news traveled fast in a small county. He stood at the fence line and looked at the damage with an expression that was very still and very controlled. "Come to the house for supper tonight," he said. "I want to talk." She went. It was the first time she had been on his property, and she was struck, despite herself, by the quiet order of it. The buildings were not grand, but they were solid and well kept, with the air of a place that had been shaped by consistent, attentive labor. 2 ranch hands nodded respectfully as she rode in. A dog of indeterminate breed came out to investigate and allowed her to scratch its ears. Zane's housekeeper, a stout and cheerful Mexican woman named Rosa who had worked for him for 4 years, had made a meal that was simple and excellent, and they ate at the kitchen table because Zane did not stand on ceremony. Over supper, he laid out what he knew and what he thought. "Holt is escalating," he said. "The legal challenges failed, so he's moved to direct harassment. What he's done to your cornfield is technically criminal trespass and destruction of property, but filing a complaint with the sheriff is complicated because Sheriff Brent takes his instructions from the county commission, and 2 of the 3 commissioners have business relationships with Holt." Delia had already figured out most of this. "So the law isn't available," she said. "Not in its official form," Zane agreed. "But Holt is also a man who cares a great deal about how things look. He has business dealings in Austin and San Antonio, and he wants to be seen as a legitimate operator, not as a man who runs widows off their land through criminal intimidation." "You think there's a pressure point," Delia said. Zane looked at her with something that might have been appreciation for how quickly she had followed the logic. "I think there are several. There's a journalist in Austin, a man named Corbin Hale, who has been building a story about land consolidation practices in southern Texas for 2 years. I've already written to him about your situation." Delia set down her fork. "You did that without asking me." He met her eyes directly. "I did. I should have asked first. I'm sorry." The apology was clean and immediate without qualification or excuse. She looked at him for a moment, reassessing. "What did you tell this journalist?" she asked. "The facts. The survey contest, the fouled well, the fence cuts, the cattle damage. I did not give him your name without your permission. I described the situation, and asked if he was interested in pursuing it, and told him I would follow up with the person directly affected if he was. Delia thought about this. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see the last of the Texas sunset painting the sky in colors that were almost violent in their beauty. She thought about the cornfield and the well and the attorney's insulting offer, and she thought about what it would mean to have someone shine public light on what Holt was doing. "Write to him again," she said. "Give him my name." Something shifted very slightly in Zane's expression. Not satisfaction exactly, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a person who has placed a bet on the right horse. They talked for another hour after supper, about practical things, water rights and property lines, and what crops did well in this part of Texas, and what the upcoming season was likely to bring. Rosa brought coffee, and listened from the kitchen doorway with the peaceful expression of someone who approves of a conversation they are overhearing. When Delia rode home in the early dark, with the Texas stars enormous overhead and the soft sound of Copper's hooves on the dry ground, she was aware of something that she had not felt in quite some time. She felt like herself. Fully, clearly herself, in the way that some conversations make possible and others do not. She was careful with that feeling. She packed it away in the same careful compartment where she had put the other Zane-adjacent thoughts, and she went home and went to sleep. And in the morning she got up and went back to work. July arrived with tremendous heat and 3 more significant events. The first was a letter from Corbin Hale, the Austin journalist, who wrote that he was very interested in her situation and would be visiting Caldwell County in August to conduct interviews and examine the county land records. His letter was professional and direct, and it ended with the observation that he had already found 5 similar situations in 3 other counties that he believed were connected to a broader pattern of land consolidation by large operators, and that Mrs. Warren's case would be a powerful specific illustration of a practice that needed public scrutiny. Delia read this letter twice on her porch in the morning heat, and she felt something that was almost pleasure, the specific pleasure of a weapon that might actually work. The second event was less pleasant. Silas Vance, Gerald Holt's foreman, rode up to her cabin one Tuesday afternoon while she was working in the garden, accompanied by 2 other Holt riders. He did not dismount. He looked down at her from the saddle with the flat, assessing gaze of a man who has been sent to deliver a message that was not pleasant to carry. "Mr. Holt says his final offer is $300 for the deed, and you can keep the cabin contents," Silas said. "He says the offer expires in 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks?" Delia asked. She kept her voice even. She kept the hoe in her hand, not as a weapon, because the arithmetic of that situation was not in her favor, but because there was something useful about holding a tool while you were being threatened. It kept your hands from being perceived as empty. "After 2 weeks, things get complicated," Silas said. "Things are already complicated," Delia said. "Tell Mr. Holt no thank you." Silas looked at her with something unpleasant in his eyes, something that was not anger but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man who enjoyed delivering bad news and found the refusal of it personally offensive. He looked at her for one long, uncomfortable moment, then turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. After he was gone, Delia stood very still in her garden for several minutes. Then she went inside, sat down at the table and wrote 2 letters. One to Corbin Hale, telling him what had just happened and noting the date and the witnesses, although there were no witnesses, and noting that she intended to document every incident from here forward in writing. One to Zane Farrell. Zane arrived within the hour of sending the letter with a rider. He came alone, which she appreciated because she had not wanted a show of force but information. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, and he was quiet for a moment after she told him what Silas had said. He said 2 weeks, Zane said. Yes. That means Holt has something planned for the end of 2 weeks, some kind of escalation. His voice was calm and analytical. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to find out. How? He looked at her steadily. I have a source inside Holt's operation. A man who works in the bookkeeping office and who has his own reasons for wanting Holt's practices exposed. He paused. His name is Illy Marsh, and he has been quietly documenting irregularities in Holt's land acquisition records for 2 years. If Holt is planning something specific, Illy may know. Delia absorbed this. You've been working on this for a while, she said. Since before you arrived, Zane admitted. Holt has damaged enough people in this county. You are not the first, but I intend for you to be the last. The third event happened 2 days later, and it was the one that changed the emotional temperature of everything. Delia had ridden to the creek in the early morning to check the water level, which had been dropping slightly with the summer heat, and on the way back to the cabin, she heard another horse behind her. She turned to find Zane coming along the fence line, not on his property this time but on hers, riding easy. I need to tell you something, he said, pulling up beside her. And I want to say it before I lose my nerve. She looked at him. In the 4 years of her marriage, Thomas had never once said anything about losing his nerve, because Thomas had been constitutionally incapable of that kind of self-disclosure. The phrase struck her as unusual. Go ahead, she said. He looked out over the flat, sun-hammered land for a moment. Then he looked at her directly. I find myself thinking about you more than is probably appropriate given that we are neighbors with a specific problem to solve. And I thought you should know that, because you deserve to know where people stand with you, and I don't want there to be anything hidden between us. Delia stared at him. I'm not asking anything of you, he continued carefully. I'm not changing my position on helping you with Holt. That's not conditional on anything. I just think honesty is better than the alternative, and I wanted you to know. The Texas morning was very bright and very quiet around them. Somewhere in the distance a meadowlark sang its escalating, liquid song. Delia said, I appreciate you telling me. A brief pause. That's all, he asked, not offended, just checking. For now, she said, and watched something in his expression settle into a kind of patient acceptance that she found, against her better judgment, extraordinarily attractive. They rode back to the fence line together and went their separate ways, and Delia spent the rest of that morning aware of a warmth in her chest that she had not invited and was not entirely sure what to do with. The 2 weeks came and went. On the 14th day, what Holt had planned became apparent. He had filed suit in county court claiming that Thomas Warren had purchased the land with money that was, by the terms of a private debt agreement signed in San Antonio, legally obligated to creditors who had prior claim on Thomas's estate, and that the land purchase, therefore, could not have been made with clean title. It was, as Zane explained when he came to her with the news, a trap that had been laid with considerable patience. There had apparently been a real debt, a gambling debt that Thomas had incurred in San Antonio and never disclosed to Delia, and Holt had quietly purchased that debt from the original holder for far less than its face value, then held it as a legal weapon. Delia felt the cold drop in her stomach when she heard this, not because of the debt itself, though the discovery of Thomas's secret dealings was its own distinct sting, but because of what it meant for her position. The claim was not necessarily valid under Texas property law, but it would require legal representation to contest, and legal representation cost money she did not have. I can pay for an attorney, Zane said immediately. "No," she said. "Delia, no." She looked at him directly, and she knew her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was in the same neighborhood. "I will not be the woman whose land was saved because a man paid for it. I will find another way." He looked at her for a long moment. Something passed across his face that was complicated, that was respect and frustration, and something gentler all at once. "Then let me suggest a way," he said. "Illy Marsh has the documentation I mentioned. If we can provide that documentation to the court as evidence of Holt's broader pattern of land manipulation, the judge may take a different view of the credibility of this debt claim. There's also the matter of Corbin Hale, who arrives in 2 weeks. If Holt's attorney knows the case is going to be reported in the Austin papers, the pressure changes considerably." Delia breathed. She looked at the land around her, the 40 acres of hard-won Texas soil, the creek that caught the light in the afternoon, the repaired cabin, the replanted corn that was coming up green and determined in the summer heat. "Tell me what to do," she said. They planned it together, sitting at her kitchen table with Zane's maps spread out between them, his coffee going cold at his elbow, Rosa's counterpart in Delia's kitchen being a small wood-burning stove that she had learned to make produce acceptable meals. They planned it step by step, and as they talked, Delia was aware of something that she had not experienced in her marriage, the sensation of being genuinely consulted, of having her own thinking treated as an asset in the conversation rather than an interesting supplement to the thinking of the man across from her. She was also aware, with the particular clarity of August, that she was falling in love with Zane Farrell, and that the experience was entirely unlike anything she had called by that name before. It was not giddy or explosive. It was steadier than that, more like the slow rising of a river than a flash flood, and infinitely more dangerous for its depth. She said nothing about this. She was not ready to say anything about this. She put it in the careful compartment and went back to planning. Illy Marsh was a thin, pale man of about 45 who had worked in Gerald Holt's bookkeeping office for 7 years, and who, in the manner of a man who has watched corruption operate up close for too long, had reached a point of moral exhaustion that made him willing to do what was necessary. He brought the documents to Zane's ranch at night, in a leather satchel, and sat at the table with Zane and Delia and spread them out methodically. There were 7 years of records showing the pattern of how Holt acquired land, the false debt claims, the survey contests, the deliberate cattle damage designed to devalue properties before purchase, the intimidation of county officials. 3 other families, all of whom had eventually sold to Holt at below-market prices, had gone through versions of exactly what Delia was experiencing. Corbin Hale arrived from Austin on a Tuesday and spent 3 days interviewing, reading records, visiting the properties, and building a story that, when published, would appear in the Austin Daily Statesman and be reprinted in papers in San Antonio and Houston. The day Hale arrived in Caldwell to conduct his interviews, Gerald Holt's attorney Prescott Drake came to Delia's cabin with a new offer. $1,500 and clean release from all claims. She told him no. The amount was still wrong, and more importantly, accepting money was not the point. The point was the land, and the principal, and the other families who had not been so fortunate. Drake looked at her with the careful non-expression of a man who has been practicing law for 20 years and has learned to keep his face still. "Mrs. Warren," he said, "I urge you to be realistic." "I am being entirely realistic, Mr. Drake," she said pleasantly. "Good day." The court hearing was set for the 2nd week of September. In the weeks between, Zane came by regularly, sometimes with practical help, sometimes just to talk, and the time they spent together had taken on a quality that was different from their early conversations. There was an ease to it now, a natural comfort that had grown like the corn, steadily and in the direction of the light. One evening in late August, they sat on her porch watching a Texas thunderstorm build on the western horizon, the kind of storm that announces itself with lightning and light and tremendous columns of cloud before it arrives. Zane had stayed later than he usually did, because the conversation had wandered from Holt and the court case into other territory, into the kind of territory where you talk about what you had wanted from your life before life arranged itself the way it did. He told her about his brother, whose name had been Aaron, who had died at 28 when his horse had thrown him in rocky ground and he had not been found for 3 hours. He told her about the grief of that, which he described with the unadorned precision of someone who has learned to live alongside a permanent pain rather than pretend it is not there. She told him about Thomas, about the marriage that had been better in imagination than in reality, about the specific loneliness of living beside someone who was present in body and absent in every other sense. She told him about the debt she had discovered and what it had made her feel, not the anger but the grief underneath the anger, the grief of confirming that a relationship had been even less honest than she had feared. Zane listened. He did not offer her platitudes or false reassurance. When she was done, he said, "That's a hard thing to carry." "It is," she said. "Is it lighter now than it was?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said, "some." The storm arrived across the plain in a wall of wind and rain, and they both stood up from their chairs, and Zane grabbed the coffee cups off the porch rail before they could blow away, and Delia laughed at the sudden rush of wind in her hair, a free, unguarded laugh that surprised them both. He looked at her in the moment right before they retreated inside, and the expression on his face was something she would think about many times afterward. It was the expression of someone looking at something that matters to them enormously, not possessively, but with a deep, attentive care. He went home in the rain. She stood inside the cabin and listened to the storm and felt the warmth in her chest that she was no longer trying to pack away. The court hearing was on a Wednesday morning, and it did not go as Holt expected. Delia appeared with the survey documents and the original deed, and a statement from Aldous Finch confirming their validity and proper registration. Zane appeared as a witness and testified calmly and precisely about the fence cuts and the fouled well and the cattle damage, giving dates and details that corresponded exactly with the written record Delia had been keeping. Ellie Marsh's documentation of Holt's pattern was submitted into evidence by a lawyer from Austin, whom Corbin Hale had quietly arranged, a lawyer whose presence in Caldwell County made Prescott Drake's expression shift in a way that told anyone watching that this was not what he had anticipated. The judge was a man named Whitmore, who had been on the bench in Caldwell County for 11 years, and who had the reputation of being fundamentally fair, while also being aware of which way the political winds blew in the county. The Ellie Marsh documentation and the Austin lawyer changed the direction of those winds noticeably, and Judge Whitmore had the useful quality of a man who adjusts to new information. He ruled that the debt claim was invalid as a challenge to the original land purchase, on the grounds that the specific debt in question had been incurred after the land purchase contract was signed, making it impossible for that debt to have constituted a prior claim on the purchase funds. This was a finding of fact supported by the dates in Thomas Warren's own papers. He also noted, in language more pointed than strictly necessary, that the court had taken note of a pattern of property challenges in the county that bore further examination. Holt was not in court. His attorney received the ruling with the controlled stillness of a man who has unexpectedly lost at cards. Delia stood outside the courthouse afterward in the September sunshine and felt something settle in her chest that was so profound and complete that she simply stood still for a moment and let herself feel it. She had won. The land was hers, clearly and legally, and on the record. Zane stood beside her. He did not say anything for a moment. "Well," he finally said. "Well," she agreed. Then, without quite planning to, she reached out and took his hand, and he held it, and they stood there in the September sunshine outside the courthouse in Caldwell, Texas, in 1882, and neither of them felt any need to fill the moment with words. They had supper at Zane's ranch that evening, a genuine celebration that included Clem and Rosa and Ellie Marsh, who had brought his wife, a quiet woman named Hattie who seemed to find the whole evening both wonderful and slightly disbelieving. The mood was warm and easy, and Rosa made a meal that required 3 courses and a great deal of effort, which she accomplished with the effortless appearance of someone for whom excellence is simply a baseline. Corbin Hale's story ran in the Austin Daily Statesman the following week, and the reprints in San Antonio and Houston arrived over the next 10 days. It was a thorough, factual, unsparing piece of journalism that laid out the pattern of Holt's land acquisitions across 4 counties, with the precision of a man who had spent 2 years building his case and was not going to waste the opportunity. The effect on Gerald Holt was not immediate. He was a man who had survived criticism before and who had enough political protection that he could not be directly prosecuted on the basis of what the article contained. But the article changed the landscape in which he operated, and in the weeks and months that followed, other families who had sold land to him under pressure began to come forward, and the county commission, seeing which way public opinion was tilting, quietly distanced itself from its most prominent patron. Holt did not give up on Delia's land immediately. He was not a man who gave up easily or quickly. But in October, when he sent Silas Vance and 5 riders toward Caldwell, the situation was different than it had been when he had expected to operate in comfortable obscurity. Corbin Hale's article had changed that, and Ellie Marsh's testimony had changed that. And Zane Farrell, sitting on his red roan horse at the town line, had made it visible. That Thursday afternoon, when Silas Vance pulled up his horse and his 5 riders behind him and stared at Zane Farrell blocking the road into Caldwell, the entire county seemed to hold its breath. Silas said, "You'd best think about what you're doing, Farrell." "I've thought about it," Zane said. Holt is not a man who forgets when people stand against him. "I know what Holt is," Zane said. "I've been standing against him for 7 years. Your boss is running out of ways to make that matter." There was a long, heavy moment. Silas looked at the men behind him, and they looked at Silas, and the calculation going on behind those men's eyes was visible in the way calculations are always visible when the numbers don't come out the way you expected. "This isn't over," Silas said. "No," Zane agreed. "But it's different than it was, and you know that. Go tell your boss what you saw today." Silas Vance looked at him for one more long moment. Then he turned his horse without another word, and the 5 riders turned with him, and they rode back the way they had come. Zane sat at the town line for a long time afterward, until they were out of sight across the flat land. Then he turned copper and rode back into Caldwell, and the first person he saw was Delia, who had been standing at the edge of the hardware store's porch watching the whole thing with a stillness that meant she was fighting something very hard. He came up to her and swung down from the horse. She looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Her voice was careful, which meant she was feeling something large. "Yes," he said. "I did." She looked at the road where Silas Vance and his riders had disappeared, she looked back at him. "I have not needed rescuing," she said. "I want you to know that I have done this myself." "I know you have," he said. "I wasn't there to rescue you. I was there because you are not alone, and I wanted every rider on that road to know it." She looked at him. The afternoon sun was in her eyes, and the main street of Caldwell was going about its usual business around them, and she was aware that she was about to say something that she could not unsay, and she found that she was not afraid of that. "I've been falling in love with you," she said. "For some time now. I thought you should know where I stand with you." The echo of his own words from months ago was not lost on him. Something in his expression shifted into something that was completely unguarded, and she realized she had never seen him entirely unguarded before, that he was a man who kept himself carefully behind a practical exterior, and that what was behind it was something much more open and much more tender than the exterior suggested. He said, "I have been in love with you since I watched you load that lumber by yourself and tell me you had it handled." She made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else. "That was in April." "I know when it was," he said. She looked at him for one more moment, and then she closed the distance between them and put her hand against his jaw, and he covered it with his own hand, and right there on the main street of Caldwell, Texas, in the middle of the afternoon. They let the rest of it happen. Gerald Holt's diminishment came gradually, the way these things tend to come in the real world, not in a single dramatic reversal, but in a series of shifts that, accumulated, changed everything. The county commission elections the following spring saw 2 of his 3 commissioners fail to be re-elected, replaced by men who were not beholden to him. The Austin paper ran 2 follow-up articles on the situation in Caldwell County, and a state legislator in Austin began asking questions about land acquisition practices that made Holt's operations more expensive to conduct than they had previously been. Silas Vance left Holt's employ in December, taking his skills and his knowledge of Holt's operations to a ranch in New Mexico, which was a signal that anyone who paid attention could read correctly. Holt himself, 70 years old by 1883 and with fewer political allies than he had started with, began the slow process of reducing his operation and his ambitions, as men sometimes do when they have been shown convincingly that the world is not as entirely theirs as they believed. He never apologized to Delia Warren. He never directly acknowledged what he had done. But he stopped sending men to her fence lines, and he stopped contesting her surveys, and he stopped fouling her water, and that was, in the practical terms of the frontier, a form of surrender. Delia's corn crop in 1882 was a partial success, reduced by the summer damage, but enough to establish that the land was productive. In 1883, with a full season behind her and the harassment gone, it was a genuine success, and she added a kitchen garden and 3 laying hens and a small vegetable patch that turned the property from a contested claim into something that looked and felt like a home. She and Zane had not rushed anything. They were both people who had learned caution the hard way, who understood that the space between falling in love and building something durable was worth crossing carefully. They had spent the fall of 1882 in the careful, electric company of 2 people who know exactly how they feel and are choosing to honor the feeling by taking it seriously. He came for supper twice a week. She came to his ranch for Sunday suppers that Rosa cooked with what felt like deliberate celebration. They rode together in the late afternoons when the day's work was done, across the flat Texas country that was beautiful in a way that required patience to appreciate, beauty that revealed itself slowly in the quality of the light and the enormous sky and the particular silence that was not really silence at all. They talked about everything, about what she had wanted from her life and what she still wanted, about what he had built and what he still hoped to build, about his brother Aaron, whose absence he carried like a permanent shadow in the corner of his days, about her mother in Missouri, to whom she had written finally with a full account of everything, including Zane, and her mother had written back with the careful approval of a woman who was reserving final judgment, but was clearly inclined toward the positive. In November, sitting on her porch in the cooler evening air, he asked her to marry him. He asked it directly and without performance, the way he did everything, looking at her with those dark eyes that she had spent 6 months learning to read and still found endlessly interesting. He said he loved her and that he wanted to share his life with her, and he said it in plain language because he was not a man who dressed things up. She said yes, without hesitation. They were married in the 3rd week of December, 1882, in the small white Methodist church in Caldwell, with Clem and Rosa and Ellie Marsh and his wife Hattie and Aldous Finch, the county clerk, and Corbin Hale, who had come down from Austin for the occasion, all in attendance. Delia wore a dress that she had sewn herself from blue wool, and Zane wore his good coat and a clean shirt, and the ceremony was simple and genuine, the way they were. After the ceremony, Rosa produced a wedding supper at Zane's ranch that was the best thing anyone in attendance had eaten in recent memory, and Clem gave a toast that was somewhat long and deeply felt, and Aldous Finch gave a toast that was precise and warm, and Corbin Hale gave a toast that quoted something he was planning to write about the affair for a future article, which made everyone laugh. They went home to Zane's ranch that night, and in the morning they had the discussion they had been working toward for weeks, about what to do with the 2 properties now that they were one family. The decision they reached was characteristic of both of them. Zane's ranch was larger and better equipped, so they made it the primary residence, adding on to the main house over the following months to make room for a life they intended to build together. Delia's 40 acres they kept and improved, running a small additional herd on the grazing land and maintaining the crop fields that she had fought for and would not let go to waste. She kept the cabin on her land in good repair. She went there sometimes, not often, just to stand in the room she had fixed and the garden she had planted, to feel the particular satisfaction of something that is yours because you held on to it. Zane understood this without being told. He understood most things about her without being told, which was the particular pleasure and occasional unnerving quality of being with someone who paid attention. The first winter of their marriage was marked by the pleasure of discovering what it was like to share a life with someone who was genuinely present. Zane was there in the kitchen in the morning with his coffee, looking at the day's work list the way he always had. Except now she was there too, making her own list, and the 2 lists were part of the same enterprise. He was there in the evenings, reading or doing account books, and she was there with her mending or her own reading, and the company was the kind that does not require constant performance, the kind that is simply a presence, a warmth, a fact of the room. In the spring of 1883, she found she was pregnant. She told him on a Tuesday morning when he was saddling copper for the day's work, and he turned around from the horse with an expression that started as something careful and controlled, and then, as what she had said fully arrived, became something that was completely uncontrolled, that was open and bright and very slightly undone. He crossed to her in 2 steps and held her face in both hands and looked at her with those dark eyes and said, "Are you all right? Are you happy?" "Both," she said. He pressed his forehead briefly to hers, and she felt the warmth of his breath. And outside the stable the Texas spring was building the morning into something blue and gold and enormous. She wrote to her mother in Missouri, and her mother wrote back by return mail and announced she was coming to Texas on the next available coach. She arrived in May, a small, precise woman with Delia's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, who took one look at Zane across the yard and then looked at her daughter and gave a single nod that contained an entire sentence. Their son, Thomas Aaron Farrell, was born in October of 1883, a healthy, loud, determined infant who arrived at 5 in the morning and announced himself to the neighborhood. Zane was there for every minute of it, which was not typical of men of his era. But Zane Farrell had never been typical in the ways that mattered. He held his son in the early morning light, standing by the window, and the expression on his face was something Delia would remember for the rest of her life. The expression of a man who has built something real and is looking at the proof of it. They named the boy Thomas for her late husband, because Delia had decided that the name deserved to carry something better than what Thomas Warren had made of it, and Aaron for Zane's brother, because some names need to be carried forward into new things. Clem turned out to be exceptionally useful as an informal uncle, appearing regularly with the baffled fondness of a man who has no children of his own and has no idea what to do with them, but finds them unexpectedly interesting. Rosa took to young Thomas with the brisk authority of someone who has been waiting for this opportunity for some time and is not going to waste it. Illy Marsh and his wife Hattie settled permanently in Caldwell after Illy's testimony, opening a small bookkeeping office in town, and Illy became something of a hero in the local community for what he had done, which he bore with the embarrassed modesty of a man who still could not entirely believe he had done it. The seasons turned. Delia's land continued to produce, and Zane's operation grew steadily, not explosively but with the consistent, trustworthy growth that comes from good management and good judgment. By 1885, they were running a herd that was the second largest in the county, and managing their water rights with the careful attention of people who understood what water meant in Texas. Corbin Hale came back to Caldwell in 1884, working on a follow-up story about land reform progress in the state, and stayed for 3 days, during which Rosa fed him several times, and he made Thomas laugh by making faces across the supper table, which was undignified but effective. Gerald Holt sold the largest portion of his operation in 1885 to a consortium from Houston, and retired to a house in San Antonio, which was not justice in any complete sense, but was a form of diminishment that carried its own significance. He was not prosecuted, though there were calls for it. The state legislature passed limited land protection legislation in 1886 that was largely inspired by the patterns documented in Caldwell County. And while it was imperfect legislation, it was a beginning. Delia thought sometimes about what might have happened if she had accepted the $300 offer in that first week. She thought about it in the way you think about roads not taken, not with regret, but with a kind of wondering gratitude for the particular stubbornness that had kept her standing in her garden with a hoe in her hands, looking up at Sela's Vance without blinking. She thought about it on a May evening in 1886, sitting on the porch of the main house watching Zane and Thomas, who was 2.5 and possessed of strong opinions about the direction of movement, walking along the fence line in the long evening light. Zane was holding the boy's hand and pointing at something in the distance, probably a hawk or a rabbit, and Thomas was craning his neck with the committed curiosity of a child who has decided that everything is worth investigating. Rosa came to the porch door behind her. "Your mother is asking if supper can wait another 20 minutes, she said. Delia's mother had come back to visit for the second time that spring and was showing a strong inclination to simply stay, which suited everyone, including, Delia suspected, Rosa, who had found in the older woman an equal in the kitchen and a genuine friend. "Tell her 20 minutes is fine," Delia said. Rosa went back inside. The evening light was doing what Texas evening light did, turning everything gold and slightly unreal, the flat land and the sky above it enormous and luminous in the way that painters came from a long way away to try to capture. Zane looked up from the fence line and saw her watching, and he raised one hand. Thomas raised his hand too, in unconscious mimicry, and then laughed at himself. She put her hand on her abdomen, which had been telling her things for the past 3 weeks that she had been confirming quietly with herself, before she said anything to anyone else. She had decided she would tell him tonight. After supper, after her mother had taken Thomas to bed with a story, and Rosa had gone to her room, Delia found Zane on the porch with his coffee, looking at the night sky the way he sometimes did, with the expression of a person who finds the stars genuinely interesting rather than merely decorative. She sat down beside him. He looked at her, and something in her face told him something, because he went still in that particular way that meant he was paying complete attention. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "We are going to have another baby." The coffee cup went down on the porch rail. He turned toward her fully, and his expression was everything she had hoped, warm and certain and wholly present. "When?" he asked. "December, I think." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I keep building a life with you and finding there is always more of it." She looked at him. "Is that a complaint?" "It is the opposite of a complaint," he said. He put his arm around her, and she settled against him, and they sat in the Texas night with the stars overhead and the quiet land around them and the sound of the house behind them, full of people they loved. Their daughter, Clara Farrell, arrived on the 14th of December, 1886, as certain and loud as her brother had been, with dark hair and what Rosa declared to be her father's stubbornness already visible in the set of her tiny jaw. Thomas was fascinated by her in the careful, slightly bewildered way of a 3-year-old confronted with a sibling, and he spent the first week walking up to her cradle and looking at her with intense concentration, as if he were trying to work out a puzzle. Zane held Clara in the morning light the way he had held Thomas, by the window, and Delia watched him and felt the full particular richness of a moment that is exactly what it is supposed to be. Her mother, who had by that point effectively moved to Texas permanently, and seemed to regard this as a sensible arrangement that had simply taken too long to arrive at, was present for the birth and for the weeks after, managing the household with the efficient grace that Delia remembered from childhood and appreciated now in a completely new way. The letter that arrived from Missouri in January of 1887 was from a cousin who informed them that Delia's mother had sold her house in Jefferson City to a young schoolteacher and had formally transferred her address to Caldwell, Texas. Zane read this letter with an expression that was amused and genuine, and he said, "Good," which was all that needed saying. They expanded the house again that spring, adding 2 more rooms, because the house that had been right for one man living alone was not right for a family that kept finding reasons to be larger. Clem, who had been with Zane since the 3rd year of his operation and was closer to family than an employee, developed a habit of reading to Thomas in the evenings after supper. The 2 of them settled in the big chair by the fire with whatever book was to hand, Clem reading with the phonetic determination of a man who learned late but did not let that slow him down. Thomas sat against his side with the complete comfort of a child who has never had to wonder if he is safe. Delia sometimes stood in the doorway and watched this, and felt something that was beyond happiness, something that was more like the recognition of what life is actually for when it is going the way it is supposed to. there were still hard things. The frontier was not soft, and Texas was not easy, and there were seasons when the rain was wrong and the cattle were sick, and the work required everything they had and a little more. There was the drought of 1887 that killed 30 head and turned the corn to dust. There was the winter of 1888, when Thomas caught a fever that lasted a week and frightened everyone more than they said aloud. There were disputes with a neighboring rancher to the east, a man named Kavanaugh who was not malicious but was difficult in the particular way of men who are certain they are right about property lines. They got through all of it. They got through it the way people who have built something real get through hard things together, with the particular resourcefulness of people who know exactly who they are and who they have beside them. Delia never stopped working her 40 acres. Even with the operation growing and the household expanding and all the claims on her time and attention, she kept her land as a specific and deliberate thing, a piece of the world that was hers by contest and determination, and the refusal of every offer that was designed to diminish her. She had stopped growing corn after the 3rd year and planted a combination of hay and kitchen garden that was more practical for what she needed, but the principle of it was the same. The land was producing, and it was hers, and no one would be taking it from her. Zane understood this too, with the understanding he brought to most things about her. He sometimes came and worked alongside her on the 40 acres, not to manage it for her, but because it was hers and therefore it was theirs, and the distinction mattered to both of them. Lee Marsh's bookkeeping office became one of the most respected small businesses in Caldwell by 1888, and he and Hattie had 2 children of their own, and the 2 families had a standing Sunday supper arrangement that was one of the pleasant fixed points of the week. Aldous Finch, the county clerk, retired in 1889 after 2 decades of service, and was given a small ceremony in the courthouse that he attended with characteristic precision. He shook Delia's hand at the reception afterward and said, "You were the most important person I did anything for in 20 years." And she looked at him with genuine warmth and said, "No, you did it yourself. I just gave you the right documents." In the summer of 1889, Corbin Hale wrote from Austin to tell them that the state had passed additional legislation strengthening small landowner protections. Legislation that cited, in its committee testimony, the pattern of abuses in Caldwell County as documented in the original series of articles. He wrote that he was working on a book about land and justice in the Texas frontier, and asked if Delia and Zane would consent to be interviewed at length. They agreed. The book was published in 1891 by a press in New York, and it was read in places that Delia could not have imagined when she stood in that ruined cornfield in the summer of 1882, looking at what had been taken from her. It did not undo what had been done to the families who had lost their land before her, but it told the truth about what had happened, and the truth, once told carefully and completely, does its own work in the world. In the fall of 1891, on a Thursday afternoon with the Texas sky enormous and blue above the flat land, Delia and Zane rode together along the fence line of her 40 acres the way they had ridden together in the early months, side by side in the easy companionship of people who have learned every important thing about each other and found it all worth knowing. Thomas was 8, with his father's directness and his mother's steady eyes, and Clara was 4 and definite about everything, which everyone who knew her family found entirely predictable. Delia pulled her horse to a stop at the corner of her land, where the fence post bore a surveyor's mark that had been the subject of a court case years ago, a small iron marker driven into the hard-pan earth, unremarkable to anyone who did not know its history. She looked at it for a moment. Zane pulled up beside her and followed her gaze to the post. 9 years, she said. She was not counting from when she arrived in Caldwell, but from the morning she had driven her wagon onto this land and looked at it and decided she would not leave. 9 years, he agreed. She looked at the land around her, the hay field and the creek and the sky above, and the flat horizon that went on forever. She looked at the man beside her, at the face she knew completely, at the eyes that had been honest with her from the first conversation in the main street of Caldwell. And she felt the full particular weight of everything that had been built here, the literal and the figurative, the 40 acres and the ranch to the north, and the house full of people she loved and the life that was, improbably and stubbornly and by a great deal of continuous effort, exactly what it was supposed to be. I wrote back to my mother 6 months after I arrived, she said, and I told her I was not alone. I meant it as a statement of defiance. I had not yet met you properly and I was not sure it was true. Is it true now? He asked. She looked at him. It is the truest thing I know, she said. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes, and he said, same. It was not a grand declaration. It was not the kind of thing that gets written in letters or books. It was 2 people at a fence post in the afternoon light, saying the plainest possible version of something enormous, and the plainness of it was the whole point. They turned their horses north and rode home. The supper that evening was the kind that a household produces when everyone is present, and the day has gone well. Me, Clara, at the table practicing the letters that her grandmother was teaching her. Thomas asking Clem a series of highly specific questions about cattle that Clem was answering with the patience of a man who finds this kind of question genuinely interesting. Rosa bringing plates with the expression of someone who has achieved exactly what she intended. Delia's mother pouring coffee with the efficiency of someone who has decided that this is her kitchen now too, and that this was entirely correct. Zane sat at the head of the table and looked around it with an expression that was quiet and complete. The expression of a man who has lived the whole complicated arc of getting from nothing to something and knows exactly what it cost and finds it worth every bit of what it cost. He caught Delia's eye across the table. She held it. Something passed between them that was too old and deep and specific to their particular history to be translated into language. Outside, the Texas night settled over the flat country, enormous and full of stars, exactly the same sky it had always been, patient and indifferent and perfect above the lives of people who had decided that it was worth the full difficulty of living them here, in this place, on this land, beside each other. The fire crackled in the front room. Thomas asked another question. Clara made a sound of triumph as she completed a letter. Rosa said something in Spanish that made Zane's mother-in-law laugh. Clem answered the question about cattle with a story that required gestures. Delia Farrell sat in her kitchen in Caldwell, Texas, in October of 1891. And she was not alone, and she had never been alone, not since the man she loved had stood at the edge of the town he called home, and told every rider on that road the only thing that needed saying. And the life around her was full, and real and entirely, magnificently hers.